You have never been to see us before. I promised I wouldn't do this, but I think I should tell them about the day that Paddy and... Should I? Johnny went into town. It'll only take me a minute. The rest of you, if you've heard it already, you can go to the bathroom. Out the front door, turn to the left, there's a set of bushes on the right-hand side. Okay? Well, just to tell you, Paddy and Johnny, yeah. Paddy went into town one day, and as he was going up the street, didn't he meet Johnny coming down? And when Johnny saw Paddy, he said to Paddy, he says, "What happened? Paddy had a big black eye." And he says, "Johnny," he says, "wait till I tell you," he says, "what happened me." He says, "I was at chapel last Sunday." He says, "I was sitting 3 rows from the back. Mrs. Murphy, she was sitting in front of me." I hope she's not here this evening. He says, "All was going well till it came time for us to say the Lord's Prayer, and we all stood up. And when Mrs. Murphy stood up, Johnny, she had one of them wee summer dresses on her, you know, it being summertime. And when she stood up, it was kind of tucked in, if you know what I mean. I'll bet you're amazed that I do all my own stunts. Well, let me tell you, it's one thing tucking it in, it's another thing keeping it in. Anyway, Paddy says, "You know, Johnny," he says, "when I saw Mrs. Murphy getting up in her dress tucked in, I thought to myself, well, Mrs. Murphy won't want to go and get communion with her dress tucked in like that. So I reached forward and I pulled it out. And when I pulled it out, she turned and she gave me one." And Johnny said, "You won't be doing that again." Oh, he says, "No," he says, "you better believe it." So that was fine. A couple of weeks passed and Johnny had to go into town again, and lo and behold, as he was going up the street, if he didn't see Paddy coming, walking towards him. And when he got up close to Paddy, the other eye, it was sitting out here. And Johnny says, "What happened to this, Tim, Paddy?" "Oh," he says, "wait till I tell you," he said. "I was at chapel again last Sunday, sitting in the same seat 3 rows from the back. Mrs. Murphy, she was in her seat in front of me." He says, "All went well till it came time for the Lord's Prayer, and we all stood up. And when Mrs. Murphy stood up, Johnny, she had the same summer dress on her, and it was tucked in the very same way." And Johnny said, "Surely you didn't." He says, "No," he says, "I did not," he said. "But," he says, "Jimmy Doyle," he says, "was sitting beside me. And when he saw Mrs. Murphy getting up in her dress tucked in, he reached forward and he pulled it out." And he said, "Johnny," he says, "I knew from past experience that Mrs. Murphy didn't like it out, so I tucked it back in." Oh, boy. Oh, dear. Oh, you thought I'd retired, Mrs. Murphy. You never know when she's going to appear. You know, every time I tell that, I know how it's going to finish, and I get a kick out of it myself. Can you just picture it? And I have been that soldier. I was at chapel one day, and a woman got up, and it was tucked in, and I wasn't even tempted. Not even tempted.